This is me. This is my birthday. I'm 20 years old, and this is the first time I took MDMA. I had a pretty incredible experience, but it was really about more than just discovering the potential in that drug. It was about the context of where I had that experience. It was about the party that I was at. It was about the music that I was listening to. It's about this context of space. And that was my story. That was the beginning of my story. And I feel that a lot of people who come to psychedelics use have similar stories. A lot of people don't start from places of intentional and deliberate personal growth and healing, but they kind of come to it because they're curious, or somebody told them it would be a fun thing to do. What brings me to the table is talking about these other contexts, these other places where people are using psychedelic drugs. And even when MDMA is available as a medicine, or therapy, or other psychedelics are, these other contexts of use will still exist. And so we have to figure out what we can do to bring legal access to these spaces, or at the very least, make them safer. For the past 10 years, I have worked at the Drug Policy Alliance, which is a national nonprofit advocacy organization trying to bring drug laws more in line with health principles rather than criminal justice principles. We have 3 big signature work areas. One of those is marijuana policy reform. And starting in California in 1996, we've helped pass over half of the initiatives to legalize medical marijuana, and we've played a pivotal role in all of the initiatives to bring marijuana, to legalize marijuana more broadly. The second work area is ending mass incarceration. And here in New York, we were behind the repeal of the Rockefeller drug laws, and those were drug laws that required mandatory minimum sentencing even for first-time drug offenses. And the third area that we work on is an area that I like to call traditional harm reduction, which is harm reduction for people using opiate drugs. So we've passed incredible reforms in New York and California and New Jersey to facilitate syringe access. And we've also passed dozens of laws across the country, 911 Good Samaritan laws. So if you call 911 in the event of a drug overdose, you will not be arrested or prosecuted. When it comes to psychedelics, most of our work has been about clearing obstacles from the path of medical and therapeutic use. So you see our report that we put out last year, which was about the DEA's obstruction of scientific research. So we've done a lot of work in that area, talking in the communications and media outreach area. We also make space every 2 years at the International Drug Policy Reform Conference that we hold for conversations about psychedelic science and policy opportunities. It's happening next month outside of DC, November 18th through 21st. I hope I see some of you there. It's an incredible gathering. So that's our work on drug policy reform writ large and also psychedelics generally. What we haven't yet done is do any kind of policy initiative that would bring legal access for psychedelics anywhere. And there's a reason for that. Support for legal access of psychedelics is pretty low. This is a poll from just a year ago, and you can see the circled psychedelic drugs generally hover around 10%, with a few outliers there. But all of them nowhere near the support that we have for legalizing marijuana. Kind of depressing, but that's the reality that we're living in today. Now, why is this? Why is there such low support for psychedelics? A lot of reasons, but perhaps one of them being so few people use psychedelics. And this is from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, again, most recent year data. Even when you talk about lifetime use of psychedelics, only 15% of their sample have used psychedelics. We know that there's a big influence when people have personal experience with a drug or they know somebody has used a drug that makes them more open to policy change. And it's possible that we don't have that with psychedelics. So I remember when I first learned these numbers, and I was, disappointed, but also a little surprised, because it seemed like the people that I was hanging out with, they did not have these opinions. They were, pretty on board with not should we do this, but when are we going to do this? And I think that that's because I'm part of a subset of people that have maybe, a uniform kind of opinion about what should be happening. I'm part of the Nightlife community. And so my theory, my understanding was I'm probably surrounded by people who have used psychedelic drugs and probably are continuing to use psychedelic drugs. This is data from the Global Drug Survey. It was started by Dr. Adam Winstock. It's a self-selected survey of people who use drugs, asking them all about what they've taken and all sorts of crazy questions. It's a really long survey. So their definition of people who go out, they call it clubber. That's their language. And that includes anybody who goes out 4 times or more a year. Even with that kind of broad definition, we see that category of people has the highest level of psychedelics use. And it follows pretty regularly from there to the infrequent clubbers and then non-clubbers. We now understand something that maybe we intuitively thought of already, which is the people who go out to festivals, concerts, clubs, and shows use psychedelic drugs more frequently than the general population, which means that they should be a core category of people advocating for legal access to psychedelics or for drug policy reform generally. Are these festivals, which are huge things now, big business, is this a community of people that are part of the drug policy reform movement that are supporting legal access to psychedelics? My answer to that is not yet. Most of these spaces, we have people using psychedelics that are still pretty uninformed about what they're using. They're pretty uninformed about both of the risks and the potential of these drugs. You have also people who just take it for granted that they are going to get searched every time they go in and that somebody's going to get arrested. Hopefully not them or their friends, but somebody gets arrested at every one of these events. And for the most part, I feel like this community kind of accepts that as the status quo. And working where I did, at the Drug Policy Alliance for all this span of time. I haven't always been working on festival issues, but I would try and explain to my friends what the Drug Policy Alliance was about, what drug policy reform was about, and they could never make the connection between what they were doing at festivals and clubs and partying and using these psychedelic drugs and what I was doing at my job trying to move forward with drug policy reform. And it was really kind of that dichotomy that pushed me to start the Music Fan program at Drug Policy Alliance. The Music Fan program is something that we put together to acknowledge the fact that people are using drugs in these spaces, in festivals, clubs, and concerts, and that they have, at this point, a pretty low knowledge about those drugs or about reform initiatives, or even about harm reduction. So the goal of the Music Fan program is to change the conversation about drug use and drug policy in these spaces. It's to bring this concept of harm reduction to event producers who are holding zero-tolerance, drug-free events and show them that there's another way to do things. There's a better way to keep people safe and to make these environments just better for everybody involved. The very first thing that's important is to make sure that people understand what it is they're taking or that they might take, to give them access to accurate, non-judgmental, honest drug education, because that's not happening really anywhere else. They're generally not getting educated in schools, and they come to these events and they hear from people that they should try this thing without really understanding what they're getting into. And so the Music Fan program partners with organizations like Dance Safe, which is a volunteer organization going out to parties to put out this information. Are there Dance Safe volunteers in the crowd today? I see one way in the back. Yep, right there. We really have to give these people a round of applause because they are doing the work, going out to the parties, having one-on-one conversations with people, with young people, about the choices that they're going to make concerning drug use, and they're getting that information out there. And the other thing, too, is it's not enough just to have a booth at a party. You have to get people even before they're starting to make decisions about drug use. You have to engage with them on social media. And so the Music Fan program is in the process of developing materials like that. Another important thing is what you do when somebody's taken a drug and then maybe they're having a difficult experience now. So the service that we promote in that situation is the Zendo Project, which is the harm reduction project of MAPS. It's basically creating a safe space for people who may or may not be on drugs, but for whatever reason they're having a difficult time at a festival. The concept is just to provide trained volunteers, sometimes therapists, just sometimes trained peers, to sit with that person and provide compassionate care. A lot of times they don't need anything more than that. They just need somebody to sit with them and kind of be witness to whatever journey they're going on. And the reason that this is so valuable in festival and concert spaces is without something like this, you're left to the mercy of your friends in the best case, or in the worst case, you go to the medical tent. They can't really do much for you. You're distracting care from people who have physical needs that need immediate attention. Or if somebody gets really sort of out of sorts or violent or disruptive, they get arrested. And so when there is a Zendo project or something like that at a festival, you have a space for these people, and it changes their experience from something that could be quite negative to something that can be quite positive. And the reason that I call it on-site mental health rather than psychedelic harm reduction, which is how MAPS refers to it, is that a lot of the work that I do through the Music Fan program is actually it's kind of a service of translation. So it's taking these concepts that are, well understood and valued within our community and trying to bring them out into the mainstream where they're a little bit less familiar with this knowledge. So the concept of on-site mental health seems really like, that's great. Of course we want on-site mental health. Whereas like you tell somebody you want psychedelic harm reduction, they're like, no, we don't do that, no. A lot of times festival producers are really scared and reluctant. It seems like common sense. It seems like it's privileging health, and those are all good things. But when you have an event producer who's talking to the local law enforcement and they're talking to the local health authority, not to mention their own insurance brokers and lawyers, they get very nervous about anything that acknowledges drug use. And one of the main reasons for that is federal legislation called the RAVE Act. It wasn't actually called the RAVE Act when it was passed, but when it was originally written in 2002 by then Senator Joe Biden. But when he wrote this in 2002, it was directly targeting the electronic music community, and it was to supposedly stop the use of ecstasy at raves. The text of the bill essentially took the crack house laws from the 1980s, which held landlords responsible for crack use in their buildings, and that it expanded it to temporary spaces like raves and now festivals, and it put event producers in that place where they're now criminally and civilly liable for the drug use of their patrons. So that's a really scary thing to contemplate if you're an event producer. And the fact is that this law has not actually been carried out. It's not been enforced that often, so it's basically this giant boogeyman in the room where everybody is kind of like, well, sounds good what you're saying about drug education and this other stuff, but I don't know, I better not. I better not because I don't want anything to come down on me. And unfortunately, the consequences of that kind of attitude are very real. Over the course of 10 plus years since that legislation has passed, we've seen the electronic music scene grow. It's crossed over. It's like other different scenes now interacting with it, and we have these huge festivals. And unfortunately, in the late 2000s, we also saw the incidence of deaths increase. Unfortunately, one of those deaths was Shelley Goldsmith. She was 19 years old, an honors student at UVA. She took MDMA before going to a concert hall in DC, and unfortunately she died. So this is literally the worst thing that can happen to you as a parent with your child to die as a result of drug use. And You know, we always, it's easy to come down on parents who immediately go to the prohibition mode and they're like, we need to crack down and work harder to keep drugs out. That's a very common response. It's understandable. But her mother, Dee Dee Goldsmith, went in a different direction. When she looked a little bit more closely at the venue where her daughter had died, she was like, why wasn't there free water available? Why wasn't there any kind of information for her about drugs? And somebody had to explain to her that because event producers are afraid of this law, all of that stuff is really hard to do. She decided to start a campaign to amend the RAVE Act. And essentially what she's trying to do is to build in protection for event producers who want to put drug education, who want to put on-site mental health, Zendo-like spaces at their events, that they will be protected and not held criminally and civilly liable for those actions. So she's doing an amazing job. She's supported by DPA, by MAPS, by SSDP, and DanceSafe. A whole coalition of drug policy groups are behind her. But as we all know, federal drug policy reform is incredibly difficult. It takes a long time, usually. And so we can't wait. You know, there's people right now, there's young people right now at festivals that need these services. And so we're not going to wait. We're working right now with the festival producers who kind of see the right way, that they want to do the right thing, even despite all these challenges. And so one of the big successes that the Music Fan program had over the past year was working with a festival called Lightning in a Bottle. It's a California festival. They're part of the transformational festival scene, so they're already starting from a really good, thoughtful place in terms of how they lay out their event. They've had Zendo on site. They've had DanceSafe on site. What they did this year was coordinated that process so that rather than just sort of throwing these things, you know, one by one, it was all coming together. All of the services at the Lightning in a Bottle on site were aware of DanceSafe and Zendo and what their purpose was. We helped them draft language to put on their website and to send out to their attendees so they would know the purpose of these services and how to make use of them and where they were at the event. And most importantly, we convinced them to write a press release and talk about this approach, which resulted in the headline you see there from Huffington Post. And that's really, to me, the key part of this, where we have people, you know, we talk about our individual stories about coming out and being, you know, real about drug use. To me, this is like an event producer coming out and saying, I believe in harm reduction and this makes sense to me. And that's the goal, is to get more and more of event producers saying those kinds of things and coming out of their own closet and being models for the other ones following behind. The one thing that we were not able to do at the Lightning in a Bottle Festival was to integrate drug checking. Drug checking is a service where people can test their drugs to find out if they actually are what they were told they were. The landscape of drug use has changed, even in the past 5 years. There's all sorts of novel psychoactive substances that are designed to mimic the effects of more popular drugs like MDMA and like LSD. And unfortunately, a lot of these substances are riskier. And because we are operating in a prohibition and unregulated sort of environment, people who have the intent to use LSD or the intent to use MDMA and get sold some kind of white powder or some anonymous blotter or whatever it is may not know what they're using, to very dangerous sort of results. And so drug checking is the best service that we have to try and prevent deaths and hospitalizations and other negative outcomes as a result of this. It has the most potential to save people's lives. It's also the hardest for event producers and whatnot to contemplate. It really pushes up against their understanding that we're doing things in terms of people's health and then still operating under a prohibition-based society. Because drug checking, of course, as you can see in the photo, kind of requires the drugs actually to be present. There's small amounts of the drugs that, you know, have to be kind of out in the open. And so that makes it really hard to contemplate for an event producer and certainly for the law enforcement that is also working at the festival. That's why ending drug arrests at festivals and more broadly in our society is incredibly important. And this is part of the further goal of the Music Fan program is to build the understanding that drug arrests are a harm. That's a harm, and that's not really taking into account people's health. Drug possession arrests don't stop people from using drugs, and they're very detrimental to people's lives individually. The process of decriminalizing drug possession, ending drug arrests, not just at festivals but more broadly, would clear the path incredibly for drug checking and all sorts of harm reduction services, the kind that we want to see in festival spaces. If I were to wave a wand, create the perfect festival environment where they had drug education, a Zendo space to go if you were having a difficult time, drug checking if you needed it, it's still not going to answer the question of how people are acquiring these substances. That's really pushing far down the road of people's understanding. I think we'll get there. I think we'll get to that space when we actually can bring up that question of legal access. And to me, that's the strategy. That's the strategy that I'm working on as part of the Music Fan program, is to bring all of these services to the table, bring all of these, go through this step by step, because all of those things are going to be necessary to create an ideal festival, concert, club environment. And that's regardless of what kind of drug control system that we have. If all of the psychedelics were legal tomorrow, I would want it to be in a world where I would have drug education, where I would have Zendo spaces, all of that stuff would be available. And so the work that we're doing, I think, is kind of building that world where legal access to psychedelics makes sense. On the one hand, you want to see the medical and therapeutic use. You want to build that and give people access, ways to experience psychedelics in that context. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that people are always going to want to have other experiences, things that are just about fun and exploration, and we see that happening now. And so the work that I'm doing is building those spaces in festival and club environments. And they will be put into a festival space where it's safe, where people are really creating an ideal environment for where it happens. Festivals are really privileged spaces, and especially now, they're extremely expensive for young people to get into. And so in some way, the work that's being done to make those spaces ideal and safer and whatnot is really only going to apply to that privileged community. That's a little bit of a limitation. So I have two responses. First is we should do what we can, and we should create this model that hopefully can be copied and expanded to broader society. And the second part is that it is important to bring that point to the festival-going community. I think there's a lot of consciousness raising that needs to happen among that community, and whether it's about harm reduction or about the drug war or about their relative level of privilege, I think that's all really important. So I would say I think we're kind of at phase one of reaching this community. It's the very beginning, and there's a lot of work to do. It's a difficult subject. Just talking drug policy reform, even the 10 years that I've been involved, the conversation has changed so much. I have an understanding about drug use is that we started at the two extreme poles, right? We started talking about a lot of opiate harm reduction, which is people who are in incredible pain. They're causing a lot of harm to themselves and also to society, and so we just needed to critically kind of focus on that population. And then at the other end, you have people using marijuana, and it's just it's gratuitous, because they're not causing harm really to themselves or anyone else around them, but they're suffering a lot of impact from the drug war. So we kind of started at these edges, whereas you have more in the middle, people who are using psychedelics, especially in festival spaces where, there's definitely a range. People are using and they're experiencing positive things. There's also there are quite negative impacts, not just on the community, but sometimes the individuals. So I think we kind of had to work our way inward to get to the middle. If you're specifically focusing on education, connecting with DanceSafe is the best way to get involved. They are the ones that are really promoting this education. New York has a chapter. They have a very active chapter. I just am kind of reflecting on my own friends with whom I have used psychedelics, and they were not in favor of legalization. I would question them about this, and they're like, oh, it's really dangerous. And I'm like, but you. And like, so like that's kind of like the critical thing for me. It's like, it's that attitude of like, even for yourself, it's like, it's okay for me, but like, not for that other person. I'm worried about it. And like, I think if you don't even have the experience yourself, it just all seems crazy and chaotic. So I don't know, but that's my interpretation. We're most familiar with the kind of drug checking where individuals test it themselves or they have someone test it for them. One of the things that I like to promote or explain to event producers is you can do that. You can do drug checking in a kind of back of house way. Like you can just use the substances that are confiscated at entry searches or that fall on the ground or whatever, and you can have a sort of like not available to the public system of checking those drugs. And then the ideal thing is if something is discovered that's dangerous or whatever, then you do an alert or some kind of notification out to the public. So that's still, I mean, that's basically drug checking as operational in a prohibition environment, but it is possible.